Hello everyone, this is Mark Beech. I'm the editor of Dante magazine, Arts, Culture, Lifestyle, covering music of all kinds, rock, pop, and also classical jazz. I'm also the editor of music reference books, including the Dictionary of Rock and Pop Names and others. I was recently asked to go on the BBC to talk about the tragic death of Cecil Taylor, who's died in Brooklyn at the age of 89. And I thought it might be useful to assemble some of these thoughts for YouTube here, not having got a tape. What you're hearing in the background is a little bit of Cecil Taylor's free improvisation number 3 from Ron Mann's 1981 free jazz documentary Imagine the Sound. I don't own the copyright of this, but anyway, the main thing I thought was to put down some of my thoughts. The first question I was being asked is how Cecil Taylor will be remembered. Now, this is a slightly difficult one because it could be argued by some in the jazz fraternity, as is often seen as a jazz man, that he won't be so well remembered because not so many of his albums were mega successful or even got mentioned in some of the lists of top 100 jazz albums. I think that, however, is gloriously unfair. He did some quite classic albums in his own right, and not only does he deserve to be remembered, but also he should be known by people who don't already know him because his work is quite extraordinary. However, how to describe him perhaps is more to the case. He was a pianist first, an improvisational pianist second, a poet third, and fourth, the last and probably least, he was not quite a jazz man. He never defined himself totally as such, although he accepted some major jazz prizes along the way, and in fact he rejected labels even that he was saying that he was a professional musician. As you can tell by that, he was certainly an uncompromising force who refused to be categorized, a rebel for sure. Force of nature, an acquired taste with his atonal work, long improvisations going on for an hour or so, which left some people in the audience almost running for the exits, and in an endurance test, and others saying that he was an unhallowed genius who deserved to be heard and given the chance for speaking out bravely. How did his musical career start? Well, in the 1950s, he was raised in Queens, New York. His mother was a major influence. And initially, although she was a music lover herself, she suggested that he became a professional, doing either law or becoming a doctor. And he started playing piano at 6, and it was clear that that's what he wanted to do, so she suggested he played 6 days a week. He played 7 and became a virtuoso very quickly. Although she died young, he went on to fulfill her dream by going on to study at the New York College of Music, and then near where some of his family lived in the New England Conservatory. During that time, he loved the music of Bartók and Stravinsky, the more less melodic end, shall we say, of the classical music range, and also said that his education was completed in the evening by going to jazz clubs where he listened to the music of influenced by Tatum, Ellington, Parker, and Monk. In 1956, he recorded his first album, a jazz group effort called Jazz Advance. He was only 27. It was quite an extraordinary work. No more cool school going on here at all. Whatever Cecil Taylor was, he was never really a particularly cool individual, apart from the fact that he did his own thing, and there was a lot of passion going into this music, which is interesting. One of the people I edited when I was working at Bloomberg was Mike Sverin, the New York Times jazz critic, and he worked for various other companies as well. Now, Mike was one man who mentioned to me Jazz Advance a long time ago, saying that he thought it was a quite powerful piece of work, and it certainly is. What did he sound like live? I'm going to jump ahead very slightly to say that having heard him at the Barbican, then certainly he was quite a force of nature there. As a performer, he wore athletic clothes, he attacked the piano, this clothing allowed him to bang out polyrhythms, juddering motifs, even using his fists sometimes at high tempo. Right hand, rather than stating just one theme, was often above the middle C, as you see in some of this video, practically acting as a whirling ride cymbal, while the left was hitting all the 88 tuned drums, as referred to on the keys on the standard piano, as a bass drum type sound. From the beginning, he obviously, playing at the Newport Jazz Festival, was revered by some of his fellow musicians such as Jill Evans and John Coltrane, who worked with him. Others found him a difficult man. By 1962, his live jazz album, recorded in Copenhagen, featured some very combative performances, including that with his drummer at the time, Sonny Murray. He also worked with British percussionist a lot, Tony Huxley, and Max Roach, of course, and Max, who I saw play with Cecil Saylor at the Barbican, said that going on stage with Cecil was pretty much like a boxer going into the ring with Jack Johnson or Mike Tyson. It was a fairly combative experience. The question was asked, well, so you had a bright start. Did this continue? And in all honesty, it probably didn't. There were some classic albums in the 1960s. Unit Structures has got some very interesting contemporary classical leanings going on, but nonetheless, he was starting to develop by the end of the 60s into a great improviser who would talk for who would play for maybe 50 minutes or so at a time. He said that while the record company had said that he probably could make more money by making commercial jazz, he wasn't interested in that. He'd prefer not to prostitute his art, and would prefer, as he was at the time, washing dishes and being a dry cleaner. However, come the 70s, he was starting to make a living from touring, particularly from in Europe, which he did for a long time. Did he mellow? Well, actually, despite all this, he probably did. You go to something like the 1991 album, Tree of Life, and it's getting to be quieter and meditative. So there was even some slowing down after this fundamental explosion that we can hear on this particular recording. We'll hear a bit more of the end here. He was becoming rather than a rebel, slightly ironically, an establishment figure, winning a Guggenheim Fellowship, a MacArthur Fellowship, a Kyoto Prize, which resulted in some problems when, and a court case when someone tried to take the money off him, and he got non-reductory. He became a university professor of music. But despite all this, then if one's asked for his epitaph, I suppose you'd say, and it's true of many of us, that, like, in terms of the old Frank Sinatra song, he did it his way. Given the quality of music, that's no bad epitaph in the case of Cecil Taylor. He certainly did it his way, and he wouldn't bow to anyone else, and he did exactly what he wanted to do. He's a polarizing force. There would be those who would regard him as being almost, and I say this advisedly, as something of a joke, as the King's New closed and people didn't dare criticise what he's doing. I'm thinking of the UK's comedy fast show Jazz Club, with its bizarre attacks on the piano, and on the other hand, there were those who saw him as being a very brave man for doing these complex improvised sounds, which nobody else had done and has done in the world of jazz. And whether you see it as jazz or something else, it's certainly an interesting one. In this brief narration, I've not really got onto the fact that he also did many other things as well. Somehow or another, we've not mentioned the fact that he was a very active poet. He had political leanings as well, with some of the things he was doing with his African-influenced titles. An extraordinary force, and a sad loss to the world that we've no longer got him. However, let's stop now and listen to some of his music and make your own mind up. Enjoy, or at least enjoy what follows. And I hope this has been an interesting introduction to a man who, if you don't have an introduction, now you do, and is worthwhile exploring. Of those great albums we've mentioned there, Tree of Life, particularly good, I would say. The debut album, Jazz Advance, Nefertiti, in whatever form you get it, as a live Copenhagen, and Unit Structures, all great albums. Thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye.